Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Advent Bible study. Good to see so many of you here this morning. So, I already heard some discussion about the passage while everybody was gathering, so anxious to get started. But let's start with a word of prayer this morning. God, as we come into this Advent season and we begin to watch and wait for the birth of the Messiah, be with us in this time of study and fellowship. Open our hearts and our minds, our eyes and our ears to all that you have prepared for us, that we can receive your word in a way that influences everything that we do. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Amen. All right. So, morning.
Morning.
So,
Should we go on now? You have been talked about. It's usually very fun. It's only 8:45 anyway. Another job for you.
That's Adam's job.
I'm probably delegated, eh?
Oh, yeah.
I'm good at going around spotting things like that.
Oh, I noticed it.
I'll check your toilet roll holders later.
okay. Right, so our study for Advent is a little different than what we've done the last couple of studies. Obviously, last time we were together, we were looking at multiple chapters of a book at one time. And now we've gone to looking at just a few verses at one time. So we'll take a little different approach and see where that takes us. I want to start today with a little background information about the book of Isaiah. And I recognize I say Isaiah and you say Isaiah. We'll just have to agree to disagree because I will not be able to remember to change that. And so we'll talk about that. We'll go through the text, and then during the whole study, I want to think about how the passages that we're looking at shape, or maybe don't shape, our beliefs and our practices, especially around the celebration of Advent and Christmas. So we'll look at that as we go along. And I'll explain this handout sheet to you as well in just a minute. But just a little information about the book of Isaiah. The only reference to Isaiah in the Bible comes from his own reference in the book of Isaiah. Obviously, it's quoted elsewhere in the Bible, especially in the New Testament. In the Gospels, there's a lot of quotes from Isaiah. But according to what we do know and what the first chapter of Isaiah tells us is that Isaiah would have been a prophet in the kingdom of Judah during the 8th century BC. He lived during the reigns of 4 different kings. That's how we're able to get an estimate of when he lived. And it tells us in the first few verses of chapter 1 that those kings were Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And all 4 of them were rulers of Judah in the second half of the 8th century BC. So from a time standpoint, that's where we are. Isaiah is, as you probably know, one of the longer books in the Old Testament, 66 chapters, I believe. Isaiah is probably the foremost of the major prophets of the Old Testament as far as the influence that these writings have had, really from the time they were written up until now. I read one description that talked about how Isaiah is often called the 5th gospel, which I had not heard, and I'm not sure that's quite right, but but that it occupies that sort of primacy in people's minds is something to keep in our thoughts. Scholars have identified 3 roughly equal sections of the book of Isaiah that we believe are written by 3 different authors at 3 different times. And so I'm going to talk more about that next week in sort of the background bit that I'll do, and we can talk a little bit about what's different between them. But it's worth knowing that all 4 of the passages that we'll study in this study come from the first section, which is chapters 1 through 39. So that gives us a starting point for what we're looking at. So just a little bit more of the context about Isaiah. During the time that Isaiah was active, again, the late 8th century BC, the Assyrian Empire was expanding westward. Assyria was centered around sort of modern day Iraq, if that helps give you some perspective, and they were expanding westward towards the Mediterranean. And so in the sort of the latter half of the 8th century BC, they had first conquered Aram, which is roughly where modern Syria is today. Then in 722 BC, they conquered the kingdom of Israel, which was the northern kingdom, and then finally conquered Judah, the southern kingdom, in the year 701 BC. So Isaiah was writing at a time when the people in his community certainly would have seen the writing on the wall as far as the Assyrians were coming. There was no match. The Israelites were no match for the Assyrians, and they'd seen what had happened in Aram and in the northern kingdom, and sort of knew that was on its way. So Isaiah's writing in a time of a lot of fear of invasion, and a lot of the oracles that Isaiah offers have to do with the hope of God's deliverance following a time of confession and repentance. So we're going to start looking at a passage in chapter 2, but if you read chapter 1 leading up to it, you'll see that a lot of that is condemnation about, well, it's sort of the classic prophetic model that, you know, you're doing wrong, repent, turn around, do the right thing, and then here's the reward, the prophecy of what will come. So, with that in mind, we'll look at Isaiah 2, 1 through 5. It's on page 667. But you also have, I passed out this sheet that has some parallel translations on it. I think it's, especially since the passages we're doing are relatively short, it's easier to look at some of these different translations and think about how or why certain things are translated in the way that they are. And there's not a ton of those differences in our text for today, but I think it's worth thinking about, and we may see that further down the road. So what you have on your sheet of parallels is, in the left column is the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible. The center column is the New Revised Standard Version. And then on the right is a translation by a scholar named Robert Alter Alter is a Hebrew language scholar that teaches at, I believe it's University of Southern California. It's one of the big universities in California. And he has, in the last 4 or 5 years, completed a complete translation of the Old Testament from the manuscripts. And what's helpful about his translation is not only is it contemporary, and so gives a different perspective on that, but it comes with a lot of notes about translation issues and why he used certain words in different places. So, if you're watching this video at home, I don't own the rights to reproduce this online, but you can go to BibleGateway.com, which has a number of different Bible translations, and you can look at parallel, you type in the verse that you want and you can look at different translations of it. So that's a way to do the same thing that we're doing here. But let's look at that first verse, because it does offer, I think, something interesting to think about. Let's just read the 4 versions that we have, and I'll start with the one that's in our Bibles that we have with us. So verse 1 says, "This is the message which God gave to Isaiah, son of Amos, about Judah and Jerusalem." Somebody want to read each of the following ones?
In days to come, the mountain where the temple stands.
Oh, sorry, no.
No.
Read the first verse in the
First
other
verse,
translations.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right, that's all right.
I'm asleep, sorry.
No.
The same thing.
So where are we,
The
sorry?
same thing.
Just,
In the same verse.
just read the first verse of, yeah.
First one, which one? Anyone, that one.
Oh, okay. Sorry, excuse me.
No.
The word that Isaiah, son of Amos, prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem.
All right,
And it shall be at the
No,
end.
no. We're only doing the first verse.
That's okay.
First one.
Somebody want to read the
Okay,
first
go out and start again.
verse from the NRSV?
The word that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem.
Somebody want to read the one from the 3rd column?
The word that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw in a vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem.
All right. So all of those pretty much say the same thing, but what do we notice that's different about them?
Prophecies and visions.
Prophecies and visions
Messages.
and messages, yeah.
Is it the same word in Hebrew for all those 3 things?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think the idea that you could translate that as these different things is probably true. I was thinking about the verb that's used, especially in the New Revised Standard Version and the altered translation, because it talks about how how Isaiah saw.
Rather than prophesied.
Yeah.
That's just vision, isn't it?
So this may be like super specific or nitpicky, but I think it's interesting to think about is, all 4 of these were, probably using the same manuscript text that they translated out of. And 2 of them translated as the word Isaiah saw, one adding in vision, just to clarify that, and the others talked about a message that's given or a prophecy.
Would he not have to either have a dream or see a vision before he could prophesy?
Well, I think some of that is implied. And I think, as I said, I think we could read any of these translations and get the gist of what is behind it.
In the Good News one, it says the message which God gave. God wasn't mentioned in the other 3.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mm.
I'm not a grammar expert, but the first one, the Tanaka,
Tanakh.
is an active thing. It's what he prophesied. The other is what God's given to him.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
You've often mentioned about people's names. Is there anything about this guy, Amos,
Yeah.
which sounds like Amos, but it's
Yes.
different? Does it mean, I mean, is it trying to imply that Isaiah was a real person or not just an idea?
Well, I think it does identify him as a historic person, yeah.
It's almost like
But-
trying to verify it.
Yeah, yeah.
Who was Amos?
Huh?
Who was Amos?
Isaiah's father.
It's not harking back to somewhere earlier in the.
No, I don't-
Like we had
It's not mentioned
I don't-
elsewhere.
no, I
other,
Okay.
other studies we've done, we've got a lot about the use of names. I remember when we did
Yeah,
Ruth,
yeah.
all the names have significance.
No, I don't think that's,
Yes, I would.
I don't think that's the case here. But I think you're probably right in that it does try to place him as an actual, historical
A real
person, yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, so that's just one example of, if you look at parallel translations, recognizing that everything that we read, unless anybody in here reads Hebrew, which I don't think is probably the case, everything that we read, from the standpoint of reading the Bible, is a translation. And different, each of these versions would have had different purposes for their translation, different audiences, different biases, based on whoever's doing the translation. And so you get 4 different renderings of that verse that basically mean the same thing, but if you really want to get down in the weeds with it, there are differences in it. And so I just want to put that out there as well. Oftentimes I think I preached at Nelms on Sunday and talked about literalism and some of the dangers of literalism, and this could be one of them, is if you're overly literal in your understanding of the Bible, different translations are gonna tell you different things. And,
Brian,
Yeah.
can I just ask a question?
yeah,
Every time they produce a new version of
Yeah.
the Bible, do they go back to the original text, or is it like because I always thought the Good News Bible was very reader-friendly. Was it taken from a different Bible and made easy, or has it gone straight back to the original text?
well, that's a good question. It depends on the translation. And some are sort of re-renderings of older translations. There's a new King James version, for example, and my understanding is that basically was just a rewriting of the King James, removing a lot of the more stilted language out of it. So the Good News Bible, as I recall, one of the purposes of it was to write it in more contemporary language.
It's got something about that in the introduction.
Yes, yeah,
And the middle one is the new revised, because RSV was
yes,
an update of the King James
yes,
Bible.
Yeah.
yes.
And that's just an update of that, but they don't say they've gone back to any new sources, do they?
Well, the new revised, was completely retranslated. Because one of the issues that's happened historically over the last 100 years or so is, they continue to discover new manuscripts, some of which are older than the previous ones. And so, the preference would be to go with the older manuscript because it is considered more original. The whole thing with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most intact scroll that they found in that cave was the scroll of Isaiah, which I think they were very relieved when they translated it to find that it was pretty accurate to what they already had. But things like that happen, and so some of the, obviously, the King James Version, 17th century, you know, they didn't have a lot of the historical manuscripts that scholars today would have to look at. So there will be differences along
These
that as
two,
well.
these two on the right one and the left one,
Mhm.
they are both transliterations of the same Hebrew text.
Yes,
So if it, yeah,
yeah, so I mean, yeah, so they're all basically looking at the same source text.
It's the same.
And you know, so some of the challenges, I have a good article I will bring next week to share.
Yeah.
But some of the challenges, you know, with translation are, words in Hebrew that we don't have cognates of in English. And so, if you're translating and you come across one of these words that doesn't have a direct correlation in English, then you have a real choice you have to make about why you use one word as opposed to another,
So
because
this is the prophecy and the saw a vision bit.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm, yeah. So in verse 2, you can kind of see a little bit, just like the Good News, the NRSV, and the Alter translation all say either in days to come or in future days. But the Tanakh says it'll be at the end of days. So I know, you know, Alter in his comments on that verse specifically talked about how it's very clear to him that the manuscript is not end of days, but in future days. So for some reason, when the Tanakh translation was made, they chose to say at the end of days rather than in future days.
So when does that date from? Is that 19th century?
I'll have to look, I don't know that for sure, I'll have to go back and look at the copyright on it. But it probably is an older translation. So for example, in verse 2, it makes a difference because you have, well, if you have a prophecy that is for the end of days, or you have a prophecy that is for days to come, that kind of does make a difference, perhaps, of how you hear that prophecy. Is it a prophecy of, well, I mean, at that point, they wouldn't have been thinking of like the second coming or whatever we might think of as, you know, sort of that apocalyptic event. So for example, Alter argues that if you render that as end of the days, it's sort of, this is the final action of what will take place. Whereas he suggests that in the prophetic, in the way that prophets typically behave and pronounce these prophecies, that it is that pattern of condemnation, repentance, and deliverance, and that what Isaiah is prophesying here is not something that will happen at the end times, but rather something that will happen, that this Assyrian thing is gonna happen, and it's gonna be bad, and it's partly, it's punishment because you've not been good people, but live through that, and here's the promise of the better world to come. So, again, you can look at it and think, well, okay, that's not that big a deal, but it can make a difference in how you think about what's gonna happen and when it's going to happen.
But you can also question the what end of what days? Does
Well-
that just mean the end of the Assyrian time, or
I-
the end of all time?
Yeah, could be. I mean, you know, I mean, a lot of the apocalyptic literature that's in the Old Testament, like the book of Daniel and parts of Ezekiel, and what else am I leaving out? Anyway, a lot of that more apocalyptic sort of thing was much later than Isaiah. So you kind of see a progression of the way that people thought about the nature of the world and how things would end. So I think it is tricky to look at that and try to equate that with, say, something you read out of Revelation that talks about the end of days. This probably is not, he's not talking apocalyptically about that. One of the notes that Alter makes about this is, that the whole thing about looking beyond the current situation to a better redemptive time, he equates that, says that's a key component of prophetic speech. So if you think about the story of Jeremiah buying the field, is everybody familiar with that a little bit? Jeremiah is under house arrest and someone's about to invade and take over the land, and he has the first right to buy this land that one of his relatives has left. And no one in their right mind would buy that land because it's going to be scorched earth and they're not going to have access to it. But Jeremiah buys the field because he's going to come back to the field. And that was his sort of a prophetic action to take at the time. He also refers to Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, that King was not talking about the current moment, but talking about he has a dream that in the future, these things will come to pass. So see, already, some interesting conversation about that. So a couple other notes to make, just to be aware kind of as we're reading through it, is where is the mountain of the Lord? What is the mountain of the Lord?
Talking about Zion, are they?
Zion, which is
Jerusalem.
Temple Mount.
Yeah.
So the first temple, Solomon's temple, would have been in existence at the time that Isaiah was writing, and it was built on the Temple Mount. And so a lot of this language about mountains, especially the mountain of the Lord's house, remember, it was believed that that's where God lived, within the temple. So Zion was the mountain of the Lord, literally, because that's where they believed that God lived. So as you're reading through this, it's not an abstract, scene on some high mountain somewhere. This is talking about what is going to happen in Jerusalem. So which changes perhaps how you sing "Go Tell It on the Mountain." Why do you go to the mountain? It's because you're going to the mountain to sing.
They always talked about going up to Jerusalem, didn't they?
Yeah, yeah,
It wasn't just that mountain. Jerusalem was on higher ground than the surrounding
that's right.
valley.
That's right. Well, if you think back to when we studied Jonah, Jonah came from Jerusalem and he went down
Yeah.
to the seaside. We talked a lot about that movement that takes place. So when we think about Jerusalem and about the temple, that is the mountain that's referenced here. Let's see. So the next little bit of the prophecy, starting in verse 3 here, it's sort of an image of like an ancient United Nations kind of thing, almost. So it talks about many peoples, well, again, depends on your translation. Some translations are, "and many peoples shall go." Alter translates it as all the nations, and it's many nations in the Good News translation. But anyway, there's gonna be a lot of people coming. Why is it that people will want to come to Jerusalem?
Because Israel's God's going to teach them, tell them what he wants them to do.
Yeah, yes, yeah, it's part of it,
If
but
it's
why?
If it's the end of days, is it the last judgment?
But it was a Jewish tradition.
Are we gonna be
anyway, for
judged?
people to go to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices at the temple. isn't it?
Yeah,
Is that not-
well, okay, so judgment or pilgrimage,
But it also talks in the middle of verse 3, let him, reading from the Hebrew Bible, let him teach us of his ways and we will go in his paths. So it seems to me as though there's a future there,
mhm,
in that people are being taught and people will go from there
yeah,
and teach
okay,
and learn from that.
okay.
Be protected, do you think, there? God is in the temple as well.
Did they go because it's a
Yes,
safe
that's
place to
safe
be?
yeah.
Yeah. So if the prophecy is that in this future time, that God is gonna be fully present in this way in the temple, and be known as the source of all life, that's gonna draw people to Jerusalem. I think Barry mentioned it about the instruction or the teachings that it talks about. So we also have to remember that for Jewish people, that instruction equates to the Torah, the law. That's what all good Jews learned growing up, was the Torah. And in fact, in the Tanakh version on the left-hand side of the page, for out of Zion shall the Torah come forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So this is very much about returning to, the Torah is God's plan for how people can live together in peace. That's certainly how it would have been understood at that time. So Isaiah is making this prophecy that all the nations will come and will learn the ways of peace, because the instruction will be God's law, or the Torah.
It uses this word flow or streaming, almost as if it's something that's going to happen to other nations,
Yeah.
whether they want it or not. It's going to happen. They're going to be brought in like on the flow of the river or the flow of the tide coming in.
Yeah, yeah,
They're not going to have an option. They've got to go. They're going to listen to it.
yeah.
Is it actually also saying that these other people, these other nations will be converted to Judaism?
Doesn't say that, does it?
Well,
No,
it's inferred,
No,
isn't
no,
it?
doesn't say. That's what the Jewish people would have said,
Yeah.
but it doesn't actually say that, does it?
It doesn't say it to Adam right, but it's certainly inferred.
We think of the idea of the light to the Gentiles, which is somewhere else, but it's,
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's the same kind of idea though, isn't it? I mean, it is,
well, light to the
If you read
Gentiles
this, I mean,
is
you
some
almost-
Syrian, Syrian song, isn't it? It's obviously, but,
Yeah.
they didn't expect to convert everyone, did they? They just wanted to, they wanted to acknowledge.
well, and think back to some of our other studies, like, we talked about in Ruth a lot about how aliens or outsiders or non-adherents
Yeah.
were,
Assimilated, so.
yeah. So, so, again, different context, slightly different time, but kind of that same general religious
It's a
understanding.
bit different to earlier on, we're like with the Philistines and that, where they just had to beat them in battle.
Yeah,
It's a bit more appeasing than that, isn't it?
well, it's definitely a difference. I mean, this prophecy definitely stands out in contrast to the context in which it was given. Because, I mean, they're getting ready to go to war,
Yeah.
literally. And by the time we get to the end of this, you know, in verse 4, it's talking about beating their swords into plowshares. So, yeah, it's very, very much at
That's
odds with the,
Yeah.
you know, the context of the day.
Does the Israeli Prime Minister read this chapter?
Fair question, fair question. Now, I should point out, as we're reading this, that this prophecy, you can also find on page 902 in Micah. This would be beginning of chapter 4 in Micah, and a lot of it is, as you look through it, is very close. Yeah. So, so Micah would have been a contemporary of Isaiah's, not that they necessarily would have known each other or collaborated on things, but it either suggests that one of them read the other, or that prophecy was a prophecy or a poem or a hymn or something that would have been more widely known.
Well, aren't there Psalms that have this sort of language as well?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it could have been based on, some sort of worship liturgy or music as well. Certainly was a popular idea at the time.
The Micah's almost exact.
No, I thought it was Micah. When I see that, I think of Micah.
The Micah's the one is perhaps the one that we hear more often.
The reading from Micah? Is that, well, but I think this is probably the one you hear more often, because this would be in the lectionary. All of these Isaiah texts that we'll study in the next few weeks are the assigned first readings for Sundays in Advent in year A. So that'll be next Advent. These will come up, and there's an Isaiah passage each of those Sundays. So we're moving chronologically through those. So next year at this time, that will be the Old Testament reading on the first Sunday of Advent, is this passage from Isaiah. I'm not sure that the Micah one, I'd have to look it up, I'm not sure that's in the lectionary. Yeah, I'll look it up though, I'll look it up.
I think it's used traditionally in the 9 lessons and carols, isn't it?
Yeah.
They use
Oh,
Micah.
I'm
okay.
pretty sure, 'cause
Okay.
we have a lesson now, I can't remember, the introduction to it says the prophet Micah foretells,
Okay,
and it's this,
Okay.
it's this bit, isn't it?
okay, well, there you go.
I didn't know it was in Isaiah as well, though it's.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the thing about the Bible. You think you know it all, but you don't.
So in reading this, and John kind of insinuated it a bit a minute ago, Isaiah's writing at a time where there is continual warfare that is seemingly encroaching at every moment. Israel, its very survival and status as a nation is being threatened. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you know, it's, this is traditionally, when we light the Advent candles, traditionally that first Sunday is hope. So this is the passage for Hope Sunday. So I think that maybe gives us a little perspective on things to think about. Again, I was preaching about Revelation on Sunday, and after church, one of the people that was there came up and said, you know, I've been reading that a lot lately, and I can't remember exactly how she said it. Basically, I've come to the realization that all these things that seem like we're in this end of the world, you know, all these things are coming true, also happened numerous times, you know, over and over and over.
Nothing's new.
Yeah, yeah. So there, I mean, there is hope even in these situations that seem, I would imagine, to the people in Isaiah's community, it seemed like a pretty hopeless place to be. That the Assyrians were coming, and you know, they were either going to kill them or they were going to send them into exile.
You're looking at when, not if.
That's it. Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. So it does also make you think about how was this sort of prophecy received? If you try to place yourself in that situation, how do you hear this? Does it give you hope? I think I'm looking here at the plaque for the Roop Hall, and I'm obviously did not know Reverend Roop. I see his picture back in the vestry every Sunday when I'm getting ready, and I think about, you know, he was here during the Second World War, and I do think about, I'm very cognizant of the fact that I don't have to do what he was doing, you know? And so I've thought about that a little this week, you know. What did he or his contemporaries have to say on this passage in the midst of all of that?
I can remember quite a few years ago doing some work with children on the solar system, space and everything else, and talking about travelling in space. And we wrote some stories about it, and this 11-year-old boy, where he got this from, I've got no idea, but he just wrote down, they went to this planet and they had their weapons and their guns, and they were explaining why they had them, and the people there were incredulous. Why? What do you need them for? From what, from where, whatever.
Yeah.
And when they came back to Earth, the question was asked, did you find any life up there? And they said no. Now,
Wow.
makes you think, why,
Yeah.
where did that idea
Yeah.
actually come from? And you can see why they said no.
Yeah.
Hope he went far.
Wow.
We're reading here, I haven't got perhaps I'm jumping ahead, but we're reading about hammer their swords into ploughs,
Yeah.
right? But the Bible is contradictory. We've just been
Yes.
reading
Ezekiel.
Ezekiel, and he
It's
says it the other way round.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
So it's ploughshares to swords and, yeah,
Yeah. You read-
books to spears.
you read enough, you'll, yeah,
So sometimes we have to make decisions.
yes.
They're preparing
Yeah.
the
Well,
war
it
to
flows
steal
like
us
the
either.
What do they say about history?
Yeah,
The
that's
lesson we
it.
learn from history is that we don't learn from it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's very deep.
Tell that to the politicians.
yeah.
We keep making the same mistakes, don't we?
Yeah.
Well, and to your point, Barry, you know, you think about this vision of Isaiah's, you know, envisions this universal peace. Now, it's interesting that it doesn't talk about the dissolution of nations. The nations are all still there, but they don't have to defend themselves against each other. anymore. And so they don't have any need for their weapons. And, yeah, but you think about, I'm sure it was the same then as it is today, there are a lot of people who are very interested economically or philosophically in pushing forward in those areas, you know, proliferating conflict and different things because it's profitable in some way for them. So, the other thing in that section that I think it's worth looking at is right at the very end of that verse, neither shall they learn war anymore. And the only one that's different is the good news, and it says they will never prepare for battle again.
Military training is to.
Yeah, but I think that's an interesting translation choice too, because if the inference is that it has to do with learning, you know, then I think that's making a statement about the fact that, you know, war is not a natural condition. It's not an inevitable thing, it's something that we learn. And so perhaps that's what the training, preparing and training for war implies, but if we don't learn war anymore, do we have to learn peace? Or is peace the natural position to be
You take a newborn baby, it's trust, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So, just in reflecting on that, on the whole passage, do you find it hopeful? I mean, it's obviously, I mean, I think it's inspiring to read. It obviously has inspired other people. I meant to include on that sheet a photo. There's a statue on the grounds of the United Nations in New York about, called "Let Us Beat Swords into Plowshares," and it's a, you know, a blacksmith forging a sword into a plow, donated by the Soviet Union.
They didn't learn then.
No. But interesting that inspiration, and it comes from this or comes from Micah, but it certainly comes from a prophetic source. That inspired the artist or whoever commissioned the artist, or, you know, and I think it fits with the mission of, or the ideals of the United Nations, that it is a place where people gather and try to mediate. I don't know, what do you think?
Ironically, in many places in the Bible, God's actually using war to punish the Jewish people.
Yeah,
So I don't know how you come to terms with that.
yeah. I mean, that's, well, and it's sort of implied in the first chapter of Isaiah that that's why they're about to get invaded.
Yeah.
Ecclesiastes, they say time to kill and a time to build up.
Yeah, well, that's right, that's right. How does a passage like this, knowing that we would normally hear it in the context of a worship service in Advent, how does it speak to our anticipation of the birth of Jesus?
It's this hope, there's another way.
Yeah,
How we get to that other way is
Hard to see,
Through the
isn't it,
sand.
really? Very hard
very
to see.
difficult to see, but there is
yeah,
another way. You do see that in times when you look at wars, and then you look at all the people who are helping others in those wars, and all those signs of bravery where people are opposing in different
Mhm.
ways wars.
yes,
So that is there, and it's there as part of a lot of people's makeup, if you like.
yep, yep,
But how you go that step further to stop, to prevent it, I don't know. I mean, that's just a conundrum.
We have these readings sort of every year, pretty much the same ones after
Yeah.
different parts of the Bible. And say hope, peace, all that, and you think, what's changed since the last time we read these? And what's changed, you know, from the generations before?
yeah,
And you say about Reverend Root, how did he interpret, perhaps they didn't use the lectionary then, perhaps he'd avoided these.
yeah,
It's one thing about using the lectionary, I mean, but the Church of England would have used it.
yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah, but do you not think though that at the time of the Reverend Root, people would have been looking more for hope? I bet the churches were packed on Sundays. People looking for that word and that hope for the future. Whereas you get complacent, then you get a couple of idiots come along with their fingers on the red button, and the whole world disintegrates.
Yeah.
I mean, it's down to a few people who obviously don't read this, and
Or interpret in their own
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, I forgot about that. Yeah.
Interesting point made by a teacher once, when I was just a pupil. And I can't remember the exact date, but he said on this date in 1944-45, the world changed. And he says the first nuclear bomb, and he suddenly realised, people suddenly realised they'd got the power to destroy everything.
yeah, yeah. So should we read this passage as hopeful? Should we read this passage as a challenge? I mean, to John's point about, well, what changed since the last time we heard this? I think that's a fair observation, but do we implicate ourselves somewhat? Not that the 20 of us can go and, remove all the nuclear weapons from the world or whatever.
I think the world has become a more dangerous place, but you've still got to have hope. I mean, in all the disasters there are, the first thing that happens is that their neighbours and other people come and try and help to put it back again.
Yeah.
I mean, the recent floods, everybody turns out to help. You know, the whole community, they'll provide some food, or they'll provide accommodation, or they'll provide a toothpaste, or
Yeah.
Nappies, or
Like the
whatever's
lockdown.
needed.
Yeah, like the COVID lockdown. I mean,
Yes.
that was a
Yes,
wonderful
that's true.
example of
Yes.
human
Something
spirit.
to
wasn't
go
it?
And I think you've got to cling on to hope that there
Yes.
will be something better.
Yeah.
Well, the something better is the light of the Lord, which is mentioned
Yeah.
At the end
in
there,
the last,
Yes,
in the fifth verse,
yes,
in all of them.
yeah,
And
Yeah.
Brian says that there's not much that we can do to get rid of the weapons and things, but I think if we all do our little bit to help people when they need it, or whatever we can do, it might only be a little thing, but if everybody does a little thing,
Yep.
it must improve,
makes a difference.
I hope,
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, that's the thing about hoping it. You hope that there's more good people in the world than there are bad.
Yeah.
But there must be, mustn't there? Otherwise
Yeah,
we don't.
otherwise they
Yeah.
would
What chance have we got?
Yeah, yeah. Well, just, yeah, I mean, I invite you to kind of mull that over in your minds this week. You won't, or probably will not hear that passage this Sunday, but, you know, something similar, and certainly we'll be thinking about hope in the context of the Advent candle and all that. So, yeah, I think it's just something to, yeah.
Sorry, on the way here, I was on Radio 4 in the car, and so I only heard part of it, but this woman was obviously some sort of person who dealt with people who had done naughty things. And I don't mean naughty, I mean really, really
Yeah.
kill people and
Yeah,
so on.
yeah, yeah.
And she was saying how everybody always said, well, I didn't mean to do it, but, you know, they found an excuse. They were drunk. He upset me first, that sort of, and it was quite interesting. And I thought, you know, and it sort of fits in with what you've just said. And I'm thinking, I've got to have to go home and listen to the whole of what you said. But I mean, it must have started at,
That's the
I
lady
suppose,
who's doing the read lectures, I think.
I don't know,
I think that's-
because I only just put it, you know,
Yeah.
it came on.
Yeah, yeah,
So
interesting.
Prison.
I suggest maybe, if you get a chance, listen to
Yeah,
it. I
okay.
think it's on every day this
Alright.
week. So, you know, but she was saying how they always have an excuse, and she was talking about a guy who actually killed his mother, and he said, I wish she was here now and I could apologise to her. It was very moving, anyway.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
because I just picked up and I thought I must listen to more. But yeah,
Well,
let's
certainly.
walk in the
Look-
light of the Lord.
Look for signs where we can, absolutely. All right, well, so, next week, we will look at chapter 11, verses 1 through 10. And, hopefully have as good a discussion next week as we have today. I appreciate all that. I do have a piece of music to close with. This is a hymn. It's not in Rejoice and Sing, but I found it in several of the other hymnals that I have. O Day of Peace that dimly shines. So some of you might know this. It's not specifically about this text. It takes inspiration from several of the texts that we'll be reading. And I like the particular arrangement I found is sung by the Compline Choir of St. Mark's Episcopal Cathedral in Seattle.